So today we're talking about Afrofuturism and technology, and in the spirit of technology, I was going to play a video for you, but the video technology is not working. So, it's a great video. It's about 5 minutes long. It features some of the artists that I'm going to be talking about today in interviews. You can find it on our Facebook page, and we will put a link to it in this week's coming e-blast, but I invite you to take your time after the service to view it. It provides a little bit more visual context around what we're talking about today. So it's the Day of Good Birds in the city of Halat. The day is a local custom, silly and random as so many local customs can be, and yet beautiful by the same token. It has little to do with birds, a fact about which locals cheerfully laugh because that too is how local customs work. It is a day of fluttering and flight regardless, where pennants of brightly dyed silk plume forth from every window, and delicate drones of copper wire and feather glass, made for this day and flown on no other, waft and buzz on the wind. Even the monorail cars trail stylized flamingo feathers from their rooftops, although these are made of feather glass too, since real flamingos do not fly at the speed of sound. At the day's dawning, the children of the city come forth, most of them wearing wings made for them by parents and kind old aunties. Not all aunties are actually aunties, but in Halat, anyone can earn auntyhood. This is a city where numberless aspirations can be fulfilled. Adults who refuse to give up their childhood joys wear wings too, though theirs tend to be more abstractly constructed. And oh, there is such joy here, friend. Street vendors sell tiny custard-filled cakes shaped like jewel beetles. Artisans offer cleverly mechanized paper hummingbirds for people to throw. What have I forgotten to mention? Oh, it is a thing that will seem most fantastic to you, friend, the variety. The citizens of Halat are so many and so wildly different in appearance and origin and development. People in this land come from many others, and it shows in sheen of skin and kink of hair and plumpness of lip and hip. If one wanders the streets where the workers and artisans do their work, there are slightly more people with darker skin. If one strolls the corridors of the executive tower, there are a few extra done in pale. There is history rather than malice in this, and it is still being actively, intentionally corrected. So these passages are taken from the opening of a short story called The Ones Who Stay and Fight by science fiction and fantasy author N.K. Jemisin from her new collection called How Long Till Black Future Month. The story begins by painting an idyllic picture of a peaceful and prosperous futuristic world, self-styled as a perfect utopia by the narrator. By the time we're done with the story, there will introduce some much more discordant and troubling elements, and it is left to the reader to decide how much of this world is a utopia and how much a dystopia. And on the one hand, this is a well-worn trope of speculative fiction, right? The perfect world that is not all as it seems. On the other hand, there are some specific elements and images that one does not often find in science fiction, like references to aunties as a cultural concept, or images of jeweled scarab beetles, or the deliberate inclusion of kinky hair and dark skin amidst the crowd of celebrants. Jemisin is writing in the style of Afrofuturism, and her science fiction imagines a future world in which ethnic diversity is the norm, rather than Europeanness or whiteness. Until very recently, science fiction and fantasy have been genres overwhelmingly dominated by whiteness. Jemisin writes in her essay, How Long Till Black Future Month, I've been consuming science fiction and fantasy since I was a child, she says. My father fed my habit by watching classic Twilight Zone and Star Trek episodes with me. Every summer holiday, weeknight at 2 in the morning, Channel 11. If there's anyone who was born a geek, she says it's me. Yet even then I noticed that there was no one like me in most of my geekery. This was in the days before the first black female astronaut, Mae Jemison, no relation. And when the closest thing to non-white people that anyone saw in fantasy were orcs. Jemisin wonders, why was it easier to find aliens or unicorns than people of color or realistic women? And indeed, there is no intellectual or artistic reason for this at all. If one can imagine a world of starships and lightsabers, warp drives and wizards, elves and dragons and robots and psychic priests, then surely one can imagine that black and brown people live in those worlds. In many cases, you have fantasy artists creating fictional worlds loosely modeled on faux medieval history. Think Lord of the Rings or any of a bajillion novels published during my childhood about knights and castles and wizards and dragons, right? But the fantasy worlds that these authors created were significantly whiter than the actual medieval eras that they are supposedly based on. There were cosmopolitan, multicultural cities in the Middle Ages. There was a Silk Road carrying culture and ideas from east to west. The Islamic world, located in Africa and the Middle East, was the center of science and learning for centuries. But all of these diverse elements of history disappeared into a homogeneous fantasy world of white people on horses. When people of color did appear in pulp fiction or fantasy, they played the role of the barbarian or the savage. In science fiction, they simply did not appear at all. African-American cartoonist and comic book artist Tim Fielder, in a TED Talk, points out that when he was a child obsessively drawing everything in his sight and being captivated by the images of science fiction, Lieutenant Uhura and Lando Calrissian were the only black people in the galaxy. 2 in the entire galaxy. So he created Afrofuturist cartoons like Maddie's Rocket, which he calls steampunk, to merge African culture and African American history with science fiction. So he says people could see people like me doing heroic things. He says, I want to see a Hindu Captain Kirk, a Muslim Wonder Woman. Why not? To engage in moving people of color forward in the culture moves our society forward. He says when people are included in speculative fiction, it gives them the opportunity to see themselves in the future and know that they exist. They exist. They exist. Our theme for our February services is truth and lies. And one of the reasons that Afrofuturism is important is it serves as a cultural response to a great big lie, which is that there are no black and brown people in the future. The great big lie is that the future is white, and it is a lie that has been broadly perpetrated in American culture throughout its history, and it is a lie that robs children of color of their imaginative potential. Because what does it tell a child when they are shown future worlds that have no place for them? The truth, of course, is that the present is not majority white to begin with, or at least not if you think globally, and the future will be increasingly less white. In America, white people will not be in the majority by 2050. But it was not a demographic misunderstanding in the first place that caused generations of writers and artists and producers to project a purely Caucasian future. Malcolm X observed that America was not made for black people to begin with. Black people were not taken and brought to America with the intention of making them citizens and giving them the full benefit thereof. Rather, American institutions were assumed to be by, for, and about white people. This was the racist past. The racist present, sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously, simply projects that history forward by erasing people of color from the imagined future. This was often driven by prejudices about which audiences are important and assumptions about what it is that audiences want to see and readers want to read. The celebrated science fiction writer Octavia Butler talks about the prejudices she encountered trying to publish science fiction with black characters in the 1970s. Butler, author of the best-selling novel Kindred, was among the first African-American women to succeed in the genre of science fiction. Kindred is published by the Beacon Press, by the way, UU Publishing House. Shout out to the UUs. But it was a struggle for her to break through the publishing world's assumptions that science fiction and blackness just could not go together. In a 1980 interview, she reminisced, back when Star Wars was new, a familiar excuse for ignoring minorities went something like this. Science fiction is escapist literature. Its readers, viewers don't want to be weighed down with real problems. War, okay. Planet-wide destruction, okay. Kidnapping, okay. But the sight of a minority person, too heavy, too real. From my agent, she continued, I heard what could become an even stronger reason for not using black characters in particular, not using them in film anyway. It seems that black people are out of fashion. In an industry that pays a great deal of attention to trends, black people have had their day for a while. How long a while? Probably, she says, until someone decides to take a chance and winds up making a damn big hit movie about black people. Well, that day has certainly arrived, because in 2018, the superhero movie Black Panther became the surprise smash hit of the year, crushing expectations and box office records. It earned over $700 million at home, $1.3 billion with a B globally, becoming the third highest grossing film of all time. The film featured an African director and almost entirely black cast. Set in the fictional African kingdom of Wakanda, it imagines a high-tech African society that has remained hidden by technology from the rest of the world, and so has never known the ravages of colonialism or exploitation or theft of its resources. Its people are 100% self-determined and self-determining. And the results were electric. How hungry were African Americans for this kind of long-delayed representation? A young woman in an interview at the time of the movie's release says, words can't even describe what this movie has meant to me and to other black people. And then she says, in particular, I want to thank the black women in the movie too, because they were so strong on their own terms and answered to no one but themselves. And she says, I think it was important because they weren't strong because they were angry, and they weren't strong because they were hurt. They were strong because they were strong, and that meant the world to me. And she says, thank you, Wakanda Forever. So science fiction author Nnedi Okorafor, in her Hugo-winning Binti series of novels for young adults, asked this question. What if an African girl from a traditional family in a part of future Africa is accepted into the finest university in the galaxy, planets away? And what if she decides to go? I powered up the transporter and said a prayer, begins the young woman's journey into space. Go, I softly whispered to the transporter, stamping my foot. The thin metal rings I wore around each ankle jingled noisily, but I stamped my foot again. Go. Science fiction, says Okorafor in a TED Talk, is all about the question, what if? But not all science fiction has the same ancestral bloodline. What if a young Nigerian woman wrote science fiction? Growing up, she says, I didn't read much science fiction because I couldn't identify with these stories preoccupied by xenophobia and colonization and seeing aliens as others. And I saw no reflection of anyone who looked like me in those narratives. She says, I was inspired to write this story, the Binti novels, because of the need to see an African girl leave the planet on her own terms. This concept of agency, of black people existing in the future on their own terms, is a critical component of the meaning and power of Afrofuturism. It is not just about a future that contains black people, but about artists creating worlds that assume blackness, that center blackness with pride and without apology. It is about creating a vision of the future that is unapologetically black. When people can't fathom a person of non-Euro descent 100 years into the future, writes Itasha Womack, a cosmic foot has to be put down. Or as Afrofuturist musician Janelle Monáe sings, black girl magic, y'all can't stand it, y'all can't ban it, trying so hard just to make us vanish, might as well plant a flag on another planet. When the movie Black Panther first came out, Unitarian Universalist seminarian and church consultant Kim Hampton explained the appeal of the movie like this. Black Panther is black people being able to be black unmediated by the white gaze. In other words, it is not blackness presented for a white audience, or blackness shaped by the expectations of a white audience, or blackness responding to a white audience. It is simply blackness existing on its own cultural terms. And this was a huge risk for a mainstream popular movie to take, and it obviously paid off massively. So Hampton then asks, as a Unitarian Universalist theologian, what would Unitarian Universalism look like if people of color were allowed to write the story of it? What would be the story of our past, and what would be the direction of our future? Because the reality is, Unitarian Universalism and its institutions were also part of that racist past that suffered from the same poverty of future imagination, that did not imagine black people in a Unitarian Universalist future. There were assumptions in Unitarian history, especially about who it was for, about who its audience was, to use that analogy. Until quite late in the 20th century, black people were discouraged from becoming ordained Unitarian ministers on the assumption that there would be no churches in which to place them, right? That white churches would not want or accept a black minister. And so without any churches to serve, black ministers were in the assumed position of having to create their own audience, right? They would all have to be church planters by necessity and build their own churches from the ground up. And there were early African-American Unitarian ministers who did this work, men like Lewis McGee and Ethelred Brown, but it was difficult work, poorly supported by what was then called the American Unitarian Association, who believed it was doomed to fail anyway. You can read about their experience in the book Black Pioneers in a White Denomination by the great UU historian Mark Marison Reed, himself an African-American UU minister. It was not until the 1970s that this attitude really changed, and black ministers began to receive full institutional support. And of course, there are still unique challenges faced by ministers of color within Unitarian Universalism. And you can learn about those challenges by reading a book called Centering: Navigating Race, Power, and Authenticity in Ministry, which describes their experiences. It was published just a few years ago. It was a recommended common read for all UUs in 2018, and it's well worth your time. But the truth, if we want to talk about truth and lies, the truth is that Unitarian Universalism has a universal appeal. It speaks powerfully about theological freedom, about human dignity, about a love that holds all people. And this message can potentially speak to anyone, regardless of race or class or background. Of course it can. Of course it can. And there have always been people of color within Unitarian Universalism. There are African American families that have been Unitarian or Universalist going back generations. But all too often, the bargain struck in our churches has been that people of color have been enthusiastically invited in to culturally white spaces that imagine themselves remaining culturally white. The received past is projected forward uncritically, and so the imagined future that we hold collectively is one that is impoverished. And the trade-off for people of color sometimes feels like that if I want to be a part of this great theology, this love that holds all people, if I want to be part of this liberating movement, this freedom to be who I am and to question, then I have to leave a part of myself behind at the same time. Our young people especially experience this, and our young people are increasingly unwilling to make that trade-off. There's a group called Black Lives of Unitarian Universalism, and they recently hosted an online symposium of black UU seminarians and theologians called Whose Faith Is It Anyway? A Black UU Theological Perspective, to talk about their experience of being black within Unitarian Universalism. One of the panelists, Duro Farrar, who's director of the Unitarian Universalist Music Ministers Association, director of music at First UU Portland, he said, I believe in the potential of Unitarian Universalism. I believe in the hope for it, but I do not believe that Unitarian Universalism is yet ready for me and my expression of blackness and my faith. So he says, I am patiently waiting until UU is ready so we can have a conversation. To which his colleague, seminarian E.N. Hill, said, I am not patiently waiting on UU to get it together. I am demanding that they get it ready for me now in my blackness, my queerness, in my diverse leadership. I have sometimes used the analogy that if you're people living together, but someone is not allowed to rearrange the furniture, then they're not really at home. They're a guest. Because if you live here, you get to move the furniture around too. So this coming fall, Black Lives of Unitarian Universalism is hosting a 4-day symposium called the Harper Jordan Memorial Symposium, named after Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, who was an abolitionist, a suffragist, an author, a Unitarian, and after the Reverend Joseph Jordan, the first Black ordained Universalist. The symposium, which is open to everyone, is called Proclaiming a Black UU Theology and describes itself this way. We are opening ourselves up to an articulation of Unitarian Universalism that is unapologetically Black and proceeds from our co-creation and our co-development such that we might proclaim and clarify a vision for a Black Unitarian Universalism. There's not been something like this before within our faith movement. This is a symposium of people imagining a future for Black Unitarian Universalism that is, to return to the words of Kim Hampton, unmediated by the white gaze. Dero Farrar wonders, what would that look like, a Unitarian Universalism centered around Blackness from the bottom up? What would a UU theology look like that was drawn from the text of Black lives? And so this symposium and all of the similar work that is being done today in Unitarian Universalism confirms that the future of Unitarian Universalism will not look like the present. And this is exciting. This is tremendous, right? What it will look like is something that we can't even guess, but it will be informed by the cultural experiences of all of its people. And it will seek to meet the needs of all of its people, and it will be spiritually and socially relevant to all of its people. And it will imbue the artistic vision, the music, the words, the heart of all of its people, and that will be a glorious and beautiful thing. Afrofuturism as an artistic and cultural movement reminds us that the future will not just contain Black people, which is obvious. It will be created by Black people. Afrofuturism gives young Black people permission to see themselves as agents of our collective future, and by doing that, it opens up cultural space for all people of any background or any culture to do this same kind of imaginative work. It enlarges our collective future and enriches us all. Author N.K. Jemisin writes, "Here is why I write what I do. We all have futures, we all have pasts, we all have stories. And we all, every single one of us, no matter who we are and no matter what's been taken from us or what poison we've internalized or how hard we've had to work to expel it, we all get to dream. We all get to dream. In the future, as in the present, as in the past," she says, "Black people will build many new worlds." So may the Unitarian Universalism of our future be expansive and liberated enough to allow for the dreams of all of its people. May we support the creation of many exciting new worlds for all of us to collectively inhabit, and may our future be beautiful and surprising and imaginative and look like all of us, held together in love and kindness. Blessed be and amen.